What's up, world? Bobby Gourley here, lead pastor of Christ Chapel in Florence, Alabama. Hope you're doing great. In case you may not know, this is election season, which is crazy with all types of division and campaigning, politicking. A lot of words getting thrown around that many people don't know what they mean. And one of the most important words for us as the church and as believers is the words of separation of church and state. Many people don't even know what that means. They've heard the language or the terminology, but they also don't know how other people interpret what separation of church and state means. And so many times we say the same term, but we have two different definitions or three or four different ways of looking through that or interpreting that. So real quick, just to make sure that we as the believers of the church get it right. To get it right, I want to backtrack all the way back to the 1700s at the beginning, at the foundations of the United States of America. When they were starting and trying to ratify the Constitution, many of the colonialists or the new Americans were unhappy with the Constitution. They didn't feel like their personal liberties were being protected or granted the way they wanted them to be granted. So Thomas Jefferson, who was in Virginia, actually started pushing through the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights wasn't the beginning of the Constitution. It was an afterthought that they added to protect the individual liberties of all the new American citizens. Inside of that, the First Amendment, there was a clause that says this. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That is the Establishment Clause. The words separation of church and state are not found in the Constitution. They're not found in any documents. It's coming out of this. It's an interpretation of what this Establishment Clause means. To give you some context, Thomas Jefferson was not an Anglican, but the Anglican Church was kind of the main church in Virginia, and they didn't want to be forced to be Anglican Christians. And so they were trying to remove the Anglican, that we're not going to support the Anglican Church with taxes because we want people to be Baptist or Methodist or whatever the other belief system was, but they were all Christian believers. So much so that Thomas Jefferson, as president, actually did things that now would probably be against separation of church and state. He did things like he sent Christian missionaries as representatives of the United States government towards the Native Americans. He established days of fasting and prayer that were part of his administration. So Thomas Jefferson did not view separation of church and state as the state is not a religious institution. He just doesn't want the state involved in the local church. And so one of the first people that actually used one of the really great metaphors or analogies or illustrations was Roger Williams in Rhode Island. He said, there has to be a hedge between the wilderness of the world and the garden of the church. He said there has to be a hedge of protection between the wilderness of the world and the garden, the beautiful garden of the church. Meaning he didn't want the world, he didn't want the government coming in and dictating the beliefs or dictating the practices of the Christian believers in a new American country. And so for 150 years, there had been no questions on this Establishment Clause. It meant that the state stayed out of the affairs of the church, but the church was definitely involved in the affairs of the state. And so for 150 years, no problems. After World War II, all of a sudden, there was people saying the Establishment Clause means that the state or the country can't have anything to do with any religion whatsoever. And this is when they start trying to pull prayer out of schools because they said there's a separation of church and state. I personally believe, and a couple things we'll get to in just a second, but this was not the intent of our original fathers of our country. Thomas Jefferson, who was one who implemented this Establishment Clause, was saying it was a backflow preventer to prevent the state from getting involved in the church, but the church is definitely involved in the state. And at the time, it wasn't a matter of Christian or Buddhism or Islam or anything else like that. It was a matter of which way are you going to practice the Christian faith in the world around us. And so to understand how we've gotten to where we're at, there's different views on what church and separation of church and state actually is. And one of the key people is a guy named John Rawls. And John Rawls has a Rawlsian theory of separation of church and state. And so to get there, I want to show you, this is kind of like how he explains it, that there's a hard separation between the church and the state, that they never overlap, that it's a hard, complete separation, that the state stays out of the church and the church stays out of the state. And the way he kind of lines this up is that the state, the government, governs or has authority over everything in public. The way we interact, the way we live, any way outside. But the church has to do with the inside or the private places, because the gospel is an inside-out mechanism. It's an inside-out thing. So when you see this, it's saying anything that affects other people, that's the state's authority. But anything that affects just you personally and privately, that's the church's authority. And so why this is important is most of the liberals that we see that are crying out separation between church and state, this is what they believe, or they want to believe, about the Establishment Clause. They believe you have your faith, just don't bring your faith into the ballot box. You can have your faith, you can have your morals, just don't try to bring your morals into government. You can have your faith, Miss Barrett, but don't bring your faith into the Supreme Court. You can have your faith, just don't bring your faith into Congress. You can have your faith. So there's this hard separation that's there, that even John Rawls, he said it this way. He said, citizens must set aside their moral and religious convictions when acting politically, whether in the legislative arena, the courtroom, or the ballot box. Instead, they must act according to political values that everyone can endorse, no matter their religious or moral background. That is a hard separation of church and state, and it does not work. It does not work for a couple reasons. One is that your religion, your Christianity, is not an object. It's a lens in which you see life through. So many of these people that are far left liberals, they don't understand a faith that transforms everything about you. They don't understand a faith that changes the way you see life, the way you see people, the way you see eternity, the way you see yourself, the way you see the unborn, the way you see just poverty, the way you see everything. The Christian faith is not an object. It's not an institution you join. It's a lens in which you see the rest of life through. And so you can't change the way you see when you go into the ballot box. You can't change how you see life when you go into the courtroom. You can't separate that. So what this does is hard separation. What it does, it creates a compartmentalized faith where your faith is between you and God, and it shouldn't impact anybody else around you. And when you apply this hard separation, it's actually designed to stop the gospel from transforming the culture. That's really what it's trying to do. The other thing that happens, the other reason it doesn't work, is because these beliefs that John Rawls talks about, these political values, that politics, religion, your faith is how you see things, and then all of a sudden you start getting political values that determine how you see things. And this where some people actually say that they believe the freedom of religion is actually a trap of the enemy to prevent the church from walking out their freedom in the marketplace, because the freedom of religion then starts making everything a religion. Where now abortion, that's my right, my lens that I see. This is my religion, you can't take it away from me. My sexual preference is my religion, you can't take that away from me, because it's a value system. And so that's why this hard separation doesn't work. But there's also a softer separation where the state and the church are separate, but they overlap in certain areas. This is where we see a lot of things with the right or the Republicans. We believe that there are some overlap that happens in life between government and my faith, because I can't separate the two. Now are they totally joined together? No. But do they interact with one another? Yes. And a good example of this are the Jews throughout history have been a nation within a nation. That even when they were in Israel, they were dispersed into Babylon and other places, they still maintained their value system. They still maintained their views, their traditions, their faith, even though they were under a different operating system. And so they would choose to maintain or protect this beauty of this garden, but then they would interject or get involved in the government or the state when their voice was needed. So that's softer separation. Then you also have what they call theonomy, which is where the state and the church are one. And there's actually a lot of people that are Christians or believers that they think this is the best way, that there should be no separation between church and state. What happens is, at some point, they're going to dilute one another and both will be weaker. I had one friend of mine who just said, if we could just get all believers in office and Congress and the Supreme Court and the White House, then the world would just be a better place. And I said, really? I said, why do you think that? Well, we just had Christian values across the board. And I said, there was a time that a nation, a government had this. They had, everybody in power was believers in the same values and traditions and outlook and faith. He said, really? What was it? I said, they called it actually the Dark Ages. Where in Europe, they were all Christians. They were all part of the state. The state ran the church ran the state, and it actually destroyed the move of God that God had started. Why? Christianity is not a political movement, it's a spiritual movement. Islam is a political movement. That's why they try to make that work in Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iraq and all these other countries, because Islam is a political power movement. But our movement is not a political movement, it's a spiritual power movement. And so this theonomy doesn't quite work. But here's where I stand on separation of church and state. That I don't believe the government can establish a religion, but I believe they should get out of the way of our religion, because here's what I believe. I believe there is a separation, but the separation is just like Roger Williams, just like Thomas Jefferson said. I believe there needs to be a hedge of protection between the wilderness of the world, the wilderness of politics, the wilderness of the government, and the beauty of God's garden in the church. What is the separation? That the church, the kingdom, is on a much higher value and a much higher level than our state. That the kingdom of heaven is higher and greater than the United States of America. And I believe you don't bring the state into the church. I believe just like Thomas Jefferson, just like Roger Williams, when you start bringing government and you start bringing politics into the church, it actually corrupts the church. But at the same time, even though the church is higher and better and greater, I believe we are called to bring the kingdom into the state. We bring our values. We bring our influence. We transform culture. We transform the world around us. We pick up the orphans. We pick up the poor. We take care of the widows. That we bring the kingdom into the state. And it's almost like we have to step down. I remember Billy Graham saying it this way. They asked Billy Graham, he'd been an advisor to president after president after president. And they asked him, they said, why don't you run for president? And he laughed it off and he said, why would I ever take a demotion? He said, I work for the king. Why would I demote myself to working for Congress, to working for the government? And I'm the same way that the church, the kingdom, there is a separation. We don't want to bring the state into the church, but we definitely want to bring the church into the state. We definitely want to make sure we're influencing the culture around us, influencing by any means necessary. That means by living your life with the values that you profess, but also means when you vote, also means if you feel called to Congress, also if you're called to be a judge or an attorney or a police officer, that your faith, the lens of the kingdom, is how you see everything. So don't let anybody try to tell you that there's a hard separation between the church and the state, because there is not. And don't get confused into thinking that if this church should just be in control, it would be better, because it would not be. What needs to happen is we need to elevate the kingdom. Elevate the kingdom. And then start bringing the kingdom down into everything around us. Bringing the kingdom into the ball field and the teams that you're coaching in Little League. Bringing the kingdom into your classroom. Bringing the kingdom into your patrol cars or police. Bringing the kingdom into your job at the factory or your job at the post office. Bringing the kingdom into the hospital that you work at. Bringing the kingdom, but don't let the state, don't let politics, don't let the things of the world backflow into the church. Just like Roger Williams says, if the church is going to be the church, there has to be a hedge of protection between the wilderness of the world and the beauty of God's garden. But we're going to take the beauty of God's garden out and start planting it in the wilderness around us. I'm praying for you that this election season is not just an election season where you vote, it's one that you're awakened to the reality of the kingdom of heaven and what God wants to do on earth, not just in America, but on earth, and in you. Be blessed.